Hey guys, this is Jim with Performance Technologies again. Today we'll be dropping the crankshaft into the 300ZX. The block is back from the machine shop. It's 20 over now. I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. All of the threaded holes have been chased with the appropriate size taps. All the oil passages have been cleaned and blown out. Now we're just going to clean up the cylinders. All the machine surfaces I like to coat with WD-40 or kerosene. In this case I use WD-40. That out, keep it from attracting dust and dirt, that kind of stuff during this process. Remember that you're building a precision machine when you're putting an engine together. We're talking about clearances in the thousandths of an inch. You have to keep this stuff clean. You have to take your time. Don't get in a hurry. Just do it right. It isn't tough to do. You just got to take your time. Pay attention to what you're doing. Don't force anything. Don't rush things. After the cylinders are wiped down, I wipe down the main saddles. Make sure all the little cracks and crevices are clean. You don't want oil behind the bearings. You want to make sure that the saddles are dry and make sure that the bearings themselves are dry on the back sides. Don't want anything to affect the clearance of the bearings themselves. Okay, we're going to be sliding the main bearings in now. There's a tab on each bearing that aligns with a notch in the block or the main caps themselves. They'll only go in one way. This is the rear bearing. It's the thrust bearing. It's a saddle type bearing. The overhanging sides keep the crankshaft from going back and forth in the engine block too far. Control its lateral motion. Just lay the bearings in and make sure that the tops don't stick up too far on either side. Try to keep them even as possible. Now, they'll correct themselves to some degree unless there's just a whole bunch sticking up on one end or the other. You can run into some problems that way. But the general rule, they'll self-center, but I just like to make sure that the ends are even. Don't get in a hurry while you're doing this. You're not in a race yet. Okay, our bearings are now in. We're going to lay the crank in. And then we'll continue to check things out as we assemble this monster. This is a box of plastigage. They come 10 to a box. You probably won't be buying boxes unless you're doing a lot of engines. Plastigage comes in these little paper sleeves, and it's just a plasticized clay material. The green plastigage measures clearances between 1 and 3/1000ths of an inch. That's what we'll be using today to check the crankshaft and later on the rods. You just peel open the little sleeve, and little bitty thin rope of green plastigage will be visible. As I said, it's a plasticized clay, so it's not tough to work with. Do not get anything steel near that crankshaft. It doesn't take a razor blade or a knife to cut plastigage to the right length. I use a fingernail for the most part. You can use plastic tools. You can use a pair of scissors. Scissors are great tools as long as you don't do it down by the crankshaft. Don't do anything that's going to scratch that crankshaft. Get nothing near it that is harder or as hard as the crank itself. Once you get them cut to length, you want it to cover about 3/4 of the width of the journal. It doesn't need to go end to end. About 3/4 of the length, the width of that journal is just fine. And you can see it will stick to fingertips and things like that. It's best to use fingernails or some piece of paper or thin piece of plastic or something like that to move it into the position that you want. Now I've got the engine slanted towards the camera, so it's a little bit tougher to work with. Now this is something I don't recommend you do. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and so when I put mains in, I do it with the bolts in. I use the bolts to guide. But again, you got to be real careful. You don't want to drag the threads of a bolt across the machine surface of crankshaft. If you're going to do it this way, just take your time. Be real careful how you're lining this main girdle up before you do it. I recommend, if you're not building a lot of engines, I recommend not putting the bolts in beforehand, or maybe just 2 bolts to help you guide, and just tighten them down by hand. Once they're hand tightened, now you won't be able to run them down all the way by hand. Get your ratchet out, and you're not tightening things down at this point. You're just snugging them up. You just want to walk that main girdle down into place, and you want to rotate back and forth between sides in kind of an X pattern. You're not tightening. You're not putting torque on it yet. You're just snugging things down, trying to get it into place. And I do that mainly with the center bolts. The ends will always follow the center, and you're not putting enough stress on anything to bend it or tweak it or anything like that at this point. Okay, now we're going to check our factory service manual. You all have the factory service manual, right? They're free and available online. This one happens to be loaded on my tablet, but you can print it, you can put it on your phone, you can do about anything you want with it. It's just a PDF. Anything that'll read a PDF will handle the factory service manual. So we found out that the torque specs are between 66 and 74 foot-pounds of torque. So I've set my torque wrench to 75 pounds. Like anyone, I like to go a little bit more than what the factory recommends. Not much, just 1 pound. And we're going to tighten this thing up in increments. And notice I'm going in an X pattern, crossing side to side, and going a little bit at a time. We're going to do this in 3 steps. On the 3rd step, we'll get to final torque. This is step number 2, going in an X pattern, starting in the center first. That makes sure that all the stress is taken out of that main girdle. As you tighten, it goes out to the edges. So we start in the middle and work our way out. Now we'll be torquing things, you'll hear the click of the torque wrench as it comes up to torque. There it is. Engine stand tries to run away every once in a while, but that's alright, just keep your feet on it. Don't get in a hurry while you're trying to do this. None of this should be done in a hurry. And none of this should be done with power tools, electric or air. I use air tools for a lot of things, but not putting an engine together. Now we're going to break them loose. We only needed to torque it down to specs so we could go back and check the plastigage. Now keep in mind, I've already checked the crank and the mains with micrometers. I know what my clearances are already, but I thought it'd be a good idea to show you guys how to use plastigage. It's a really, really useful tool. Online, I see a lot of people in forums saying how worthless plastigage is, and they're just idiots. Don't listen to them. Run away. Plastigage is a great tool as a reference. It's not accurate. It's not like a micrometer, but it gives you a range of accuracy. It's an indicator, and it's a very good indicator of where you stand on the clearances on your bearings. Don't be afraid to use it because some idiot wants to impress you by saying you've got to take 3 readings per bearing surface from a micrometer to get accurate readings. Well, to get accurate readings, that's probably true. But you're looking for an indicator, and you don't need to spend $1,000 on a set of micrometers to build a damned engine on your own. And notice I'm not slamming this with that's a rubber mallet, by the way. I'm not slamming that thing, I'm just tapping it. Now you've got to be really careful to get this to lift straight up. But remember, I'm doing this with bolts in, and I don't recommend that for you guys. It needs to be lifted straight up and completely up to clear all the bolts. And do not ever rotate that crankshaft while the plastigage is in there and the mains are on. Now I'm going to rotate it so that you can see what I'm going to do with it. But do not rotate that crank while the plastigage is in there. All it'll do, it won't hurt anything, all it'll do is just smear the plastigage and destroy your readings. Now we're going to take the scale that comes on the plastigage sleeve, and we're going to check the indicated clearance between the bearing and the crankshaft main. Now this is just an indicator. Like I said, it's not an accurate reading, but it will give you a very good idea of where you stand. The number 3 main there that I'm checking now, I already know is the worst main in the motor. By micrometer, it's 0.00187. 18 10/1000ths of an inch, or 1.87 thousandths. Just under 2 thousandths of an inch, which is well within factory tolerances. The best is 0.00156. So engine's in good shape. It'll be fine. And as I said in the last video, this is all standard crank and 0 index. It doesn't need any undersized bearings. Once you grind these crankshafts, you lose hardness. These cranks are hardened from the factory, but the hardness only extends 5 to 7 thousandths into the surface. So once you grind it 10 thousandths or 0.25, however you're measuring, you lose that hardness, and the crank starts wearing pretty quickly from that point. I'm just taking the plastigage off now. It needs to be removed from the bearing surface and the crank surface. It's oil soluble. What I'm using here is Marble Mystery Oil. I use it for all kinds of stuff, including oiling my air tools. It doesn't take any pressure to do this. Now we're going to use molybdenum disulfide assembly lube on the bearings. Get them good and coated. We don't want metal to metal contact, especially don't want any dry surfaces, unoiled surfaces on the first start. That will ruin your day real quick. And for God's sakes, guys, don't use a brush while applying this assembly lube. Use a glove. I'm using surgical gloves. They're available in any drugstore. They're dirt cheap, and I use them for all kinds of stuff. You want to keep this stuff clean as possible. If you're using a brush, sooner or later, you're going to lose a bristle or two, and it's going to get lost in the assembly lube, and it's going to lock your damn crank, and you're going to have to pull your hair out trying to figure out where you went wrong. Pull the thing back apart, and all it's going to be is a damn brush bristle that got lost from the brush and caught in the assembly lube. It'll lock a motor smooth up. Just use a clean finger. Use a gloved finger. Don't use brushes on critical parts. Be sure and get that thrust bearing well. That thrust bearing has 3 bearing surfaces. One front there, one crankshaft, and one rear. You have to lube them all. The front and rear surfaces keep the crank from moving laterally back and forth. We've lubed up the bearings in the mains as well. Now we're going to place the girdle back on the engine and go through the whole process of tightening this thing down and torquing it in, hopefully for the final time. Be very careful. If you're going to use bolts in the main girdle, you just got to be real careful while you're doing this. It has to go in the first time. It has to be aligned right the first time. I don't recommend doing it unless you've done it a lot. Okay, now the bolts are in. They're finger tight. We're going to start tightening this thing down and get it ready to put the rods in. Again, at this point, we're not tightening. We're just snugging things down. Just drawing that main girdle into the block. It is inset into the block. It doesn't sit as a flat surface. We're just drawing it down. It's not a press fit, it's an interference fit. Just drawing it down to get it snug. Now we're all tightened up, the torque's done, and we have a crank that spins. Imagine that. Now, this is going to have quite a bit of resistance to it if it's right. I mean, you're not going to be able to just grab the crankshaft and spin the thing freely. You're going to have to put some effort into spinning the thing. But it shouldn't take a wrench or anything like that. Now, always do this. Push in and pull out hard on that crankshaft. If you feel any movement, if you hear a clunk, anything like that, there's something drastically wrong and you need to take it to your machine shop and have them check things. I'll show you how to check the in clearance on the crankshaft in the next one. Well, that's all for this one. Sorry it was so long, but I felt I needed to go into a little more detail on the crankshaft assembly. Next we'll do the rods and pistons. Until then, drive safe, have fun, and I'll see you guys later.